I want to talk with you for a little bit about what to look for in land or a homestead. And this is probably one of the largest investments, if not the largest investment that you're going to make on your journey to independence. And your homestead is where everything else happens, from your gardens to your power. You need to make sure this piece of the puzzle fits your needs and is sustainable. So one of the first things that I want to talk with you about is looking at your existing homestead and deciding whether you need to move or not. Because I don't know what your situation is. It may be readily obvious. You know, some of you might be sitting in a 7th floor apartment, and so the question is easy to answer. But there are others who might actually live in the country already, and you're just not sure if this current place is right for you, is the place where you want to end up. And so while I'm going to be focusing on looking mostly for a new piece of property or home, the same criteria that we're going to cover could be easily applied to your current existing home or property, and in order to verify if you really need to move out or not. And even if you decide that you can stay where you are, the criteria that we're going to be covering can help you to figure out which of these things on your homestead need to be improved, where your issues are, and what needs to be improved. Now, first, you need to remember that there is no such thing as a perfect piece of property or a perfect homestead. It just doesn't exist. And if you look for one, you're probably never going to find it, and you're just going to be perpetually looking and never finding, and that's going to be really frustrating. So you're going to have to make some compromises somewhere and somehow. And which items you compromise on is going to make all the difference in the homestead that you end up with. So basically, you're going to need to triage and decide which factors are essential non-negotiables and which factors are important, but they're not absolutely essential, and then which factors are just nice to have. And so that's kind of how I like to divvy this up, is into those 3 categories: the essentials, the important ones, and then the nice to have ones. And each family's priorities are going to be different, so you're going to have to figure out your order of priorities for yourself. For instance, since we have a technology-based business from our home, it was essential for us that we have a decent internet connection. And, it was just a non-negotiable. We couldn't make a living without it. But I know of other people who have very poor internet connections or no connection at all, and they live just fine because that suits them. That's their lifestyle. So my point is, everybody's needs are different, and you're going to have to tailor your own lists. But the key here is to prioritize. And so this is what we want to really do in this first section, is come up with a list. And so your list might look something like this. This is just a sample list. This isn't necessarily even our list. This is just a sample, so you see what I'm talking about here. So it's the first step. Take out a piece of paper and pause the video right now and do a little brainstorming and write down a list of all the features that you would like to see in a dream property or homestead. It's time to prioritize. So I don't care what order your list is to begin with, but we're going to take this brainstorming list and we're going to prioritize it. And your prioritized list might look something like this. And once again, we've got the essentials, the important category, and the nice to have category. And you're going to split these up. The essentials are the ones that you cannot live without, that you have to have. They are absolutely non-negotiable. The important ones are, just as the name implies, important, but they're not absolutely essential. So this is your list. This is your key to staying subjective when looking at your current place or a new place. You'll want to first go through the essentials list before wasting any time when you're looking at a property. And if it doesn't meet every item on that essentials list, then move on. Don't waste any more time on it. And then after you've whittled your properties down to all the ones that have met the essentials, then you can move on to the important category and so on and so forth. Now, what kind of things are we looking at with essentials? This is not exhaustive. Like I said, everybody's essentials are going to be different. So don't take this as the gospel. I'm just throwing ideas out from my perspective. Some of the essentials that you might consider to be essentials, this is going to be an essential for everybody, and that's water. Having enough water, and I might say enough clean water, pure water. And if your water source is a well, then typically the gold standard for a well is at least 5 gallons per minute of water production. Yes, it is possible to live with a well that's lower than that. Plenty of people do, and it's possible, but it gets more challenging and more expensive, and especially if you're planning on doing much irrigation or things like that, it could be all but impossible if you've got a very, very poor well. So that's why I say 5 gallons per minute or better is what we're looking for with a well. With a spring, we're capturing that water round the clock 24/7 in hopefully a large cistern, so we don't have to have as much flow because we're capturing theoretically every drop of water that spring is putting off. And so with a spring, I'm okay with 1 gallon per minute or so. Bet more is better, but at least 1 gallon per minute should give you enough to run most any homestead and do a decent amount of irrigation and things like that outside. So that would be one essential that everybody needs. Another one would be a sustainable amount of timberland, and this is for being able to have a sustainable source of heat with wood heat. If you have to have a way to keep your home warm if all else fails. So you can use other heat sources if you want during normal times, but every home needs a wood stove or some independent source of heat. And for most people, that's going to be a wood stove, either a wood stove or a wood cook stove. And so you need to have a sustainable source of wood if at all possible. And we'll go into this really you can get more details about water in the video in this series on independent water systems. You can get more info about the wood situation and the heating with wood video in this series as well. But 5 acres is a general, very, very general rule of thumb for having a sustainable woodlot for a home. Now there's a lot of variables here, things like how fast the trees grow in your area, the variety of trees, how efficient your stove is, and things like this. But that just gives you a rough ballpark. If you're unable to have that much, then it is possible to make do with less than that, but it won't be sustainable. So eventually, after so many years, you would run out of timberland. The 5 acre figure is theoretically what it would take to be able to have a perpetually renewable source of firewood. And then another essential would be the ability to grow food, whether that be having the space to grow it or a climate that is conducive or agreeable to growing food, or having water for irrigation, or whatever the case may be. Whatever the conditions are that you need to be able to grow, that's going to be an essential. And, some of these things may be bumped into the important category if you so choose. For instance, having the space, you might say, well, it's a steep piece of land that doesn't have flat ground for working. It would be ideal to have ground that's more flat, or at least a gentle slope. But a steep slope, it is humanly possible to work that. If you don't believe me, you can check out some of the places around the world where they grow in terraces on these incredibly steep slopes. And as long as the slope is in the right direction, it is possible. So that's why I say you could bump perhaps some of these things into the important category if you wanted. As far as climate, it is possible in really cold areas that have very, very short growing seasons to remedy that issue with greenhouses, hoop houses, high tunnels, whatever you want to call them. So those things are possible, but there's some things that are just absolutely non-negotiable. And another one in my book that's a non-negotiable for everybody is legal access to the property. Because it can be the most perfect property there is, but if you are not able to legally access that property, then it does you no good at all. The only way, if you don't have legal access to that property, then the only way you're getting in there is to fly a helicopter in every time you want to come in, and that's just not going to work. So this is a really, really important issue. And then finally, another one, this is not exhaustive. These are examples of essential items. Another one for me would be percolation near the home, or near the building site if you were going to be building, or having a working septic system if you're looking at a existing home that's already built. Some of the important items, some things that in my book would be important but not necessarily absolutely essential, would be good southern exposure. And I debate about this one, whether it should be on essential or important. And it's a hard call, because in my book it's almost an essential, but it is possible to live without good southern exposure, but definitely more challenging for solar or growing or things like that. The right distance from town or work. This is going to be, in most situations, more of a convenience issue, the length of your commute to work. If you work from home, then that's a non-issue. So that's a blessing of being self-employed or working remotely. But if you have to work in town, then you really need to consider the length of the commute. And, I am not interested in bringing the stresses of the city with us out to the country. I realize that a lot of people in town, in big cities, spend an hour each way commuting, even though they live in the big city, just because of the heavy traffic. And so I realize that may be the norm for them, but that doesn't mean that that's what I want for myself or my family. We're trying to simplify. We're trying to reduce stress and things like this, trying to have more time with family. So this is an issue. Also, if you happen to have a line of work where you are on call for periods of time, like some positions in the medical field, then you may have a certain distance that you have to be within your work, where you have to be within a certain radius whenever you're on call, or else you're going to end up spending all that time sitting in the hospital or whatever the place of work might be. So that's something to consider as well. And another item that I would put on the important list is having enough privacy. Being able to do what you need to do and not have your neighbors spying on your every move. I think of when we lived in town years ago and people could just look right in our window, and there was just no privacy, and that's not a healthy way to live. It's just no way for any human to live in my book. Physical access is acceptable. This is another issue that is on the important list. I don't put it in the essential list because it is possible to overcome this with enough trouble and money and effort and things like that. But I'm not talking about legal access here. I'm talking about physical access. And that is the ability to be able to access that property physically. So we're talking about having deep mud on the roads during spring breakup, or living in a heavy snow area and it's not a county maintained road, or things along these lines that are going to impact the access to the property, or having it being very steep and windy, and all these kind of things. We have friends that snowmobile into their property because they can't drive in, and it would be rather challenging to plow the road, and so they end up parking a mile or two down and snowmobiling into their property. These are things that you need to be aware of and think about if you're willing to deal with that. For us personally, that wasn't something that we were interested in. We wanted to be able to drive in, and so at the moment, I plow 3 miles of road in order to be able to drive in, but it's a pretty easy plowing, and so it works. But these were challenges that we were aware of ahead of time, and we were willing to deal with it because the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. But this is something that you need to consider, and these are in the important category. Then also distance from a county-maintained road, and this kind of dovetails with what I was talking about with things like plowing or general maintenance of the road. How far is your place from a county-maintained road? Because that's how far you have to plan on maintaining, whether it be plowing or graveling or grading or whatever the case may be. I've had encounters with a lot of realtors in our neck of the woods in snow country where there'll be a place that's miles off of a county road, and this unsuspecting buyer from out of state will come in and they'll ask about, so is the road plowed? And the realtor will say, oh yes, the road is plowed. But it comes out, unless you inquire, you don't find out that it is a neighbor plowing the road. Or maybe they might say it's a neighbor and nobody thinks anything of it because they just assume that this is going to keep going on perpetually. But that is not always the case. So these are things that you need to consider. So as a general rule, it's easier to stay in the same general part of the country when you are looking at relocating. And so I say this because a lot of folks get it in their mind that if they're going to have to move, that they're going to be moving to a whole nother part of the country. And I'm just saying, consider strongly the possibility of relocating to a better location in your general area that you're familiar with, within perhaps several hours of you. See if there are some good rural locations where you can meet the criteria, where you can have a sustainable homestead. And that is going to make your life a lot easier because the move is going to be much easier. I mean, just looking for the property is going to be a lot easier because you're not going to be having to travel so far to look at pieces of property. You're going to be more familiar with it. You're going to possibly have connections there. And, you're just going to be able to make better decisions, and it's going to be a lot easier. You'll stand a better chance of being able to perhaps keep your current job or find one that's similar. All these kind of things are going to be affected by where you move to. But if you decide that your current part of the country is not good for you, then, the next best option is another part of the country where you have some experience, where maybe you've lived there previously or you've spent a considerable amount of time there, where you're familiar with it and it's not all brand new to you. Please do yourself a big favor, and if you're not going to stay in your general area, then go somewhere like that where you know the ropes a little. It's still going to be a learning curve, but at least you've got a head start. And only as a last resort would I suggest going to a completely new area that you don't know anything about. That is going to make your whole transition a lot more risky and a lot more challenging. So I'm just saying, I would go in that order. Try and stay in your general area if possible. If that's just not going to work, then an area that you're familiar with, and only after you've exhausted those two would I consider looking at a new area that is unknown to you.